we'll do then, seeing as we now have 100 people, is we will formally start the session. So I just want to say a big, massive welcome to the 100 people who found themselves here today. This is an event that has been put on by a programme called Public Square. Public Square is an action research programme, and basically we're just really interested in all things participation that's linked to local democracy specifically. We've been lucky enough to get funding from an organisation called Luminate, who've given us a bit of money towards it, and we are an organisation called the Democratic Society who are running the programme. So the aim of today and the work that we do in general is to really share and build collective knowledge and practice. We work in open partnerships, so it's open to everybody to get involved, and we, as long as you're interested in local democracy and meaningful engagement and participation and collaborative decision making and all those kinds of things, then we'd love to work with you. We've been doing some work over the last year with a few councils across the country where we've been testing and innovating different forms of participation, and really working with them in terms of their internal culture and how they build participation and collaborative decision making into the way that they actually operate. So today's event, if I just say, just happened to happen through a couple of serendipitous conversations really. So over the last couple of weeks, a couple of people have just got in touch about co-production, and then I also listened to the Reasons to be Cheerful podcast, and again that was about co-production. That was a few weeks ago where John's colleague was talking, and it just seemed, you know, with all that's going on in the world, that things from very hyper local level to, you know, local community WhatsApp groups and mutual aid groups to, you know, across the country and across the world, there's a real just getting on and doing things together kind of moment. So it really felt like this was, you know, there was a real genuine interest, and you guys are testament to that, because we thought, well, let's just have a little panel discussion, and we expected, you know, 20-30 people sign up. And we've had just under 200 people register an interest to hear about co-production. So, you know, I really think there is some real value and a sense of people wanting to make it more meaningful at the moment. So just to let you know, we're going to have a panel. We've got Erin, who you'll see there on the screen. Wave, Erin. Erin's going to be the host of the session, and we're going to mainly be doing a question and answer format, because we want to make sure that we get as much content that you want and need out this time. I'm just going to do a very quick little bit of housekeeping. So if you could use the chat function where you've been sharing who you are and where you are and what you do. If you've got questions for our panel, could you pop them in there, and then the DemSoc crew will be looking at those and seeing what themes are coming up and reoccurring questions to then ask people to speak to. If you are not talking, can I ask you to mute your button? It's not because we don't want to hear from you, but you do get often quite a lot of background noise, so it can be a bit disruptive. And then if you are going to speak, just unmute yourself, and that should happen fine. Check your name on the screen, just make sure it says what you want it to say. If you do need to disappear for 5 minutes or so for a comfort break, or to deal with a hungry dog, that's absolutely fine. Can I just ask you to remember to turn your video off? We don't really want anything. Last week, I don't know if you saw on the news of a councillor who forgot to turn his video off and had a shower in a meeting. So yeah, definitely one to remember. And we are going to record the session. And we'll probably do some screenshots as well, so we can use that on social media and promote what we're doing. If you don't want to be captured on screen, or please just turn off your video. That's absolutely fine. You don't need to be on it. So if you are keeping your video on, we'll take that as consent, and that you're happy with your image being posted on social media. I'm going to hand over to Erin now, who's going to take us be the host for the session.
Thank you, Mel, and welcome everyone. This was, I think, as Mel said, a crazy turnout for what we thought was going to be a very sparsely attended, intimate group of 20. So amazing to see that our panelists this afternoon will have the opportunity to share their experiences with such a wide and diverse and large audience. When people talk about co-production, we know that there are 101, almost as many different definitions of the word as there are people that you ask. But I think we know that it comes down to a couple of key ingredients around the recognition that everybody has something of value, something to bring to the table, whether it's a different way of seeing the world, a different experience, a different skill set. It's about sharing power and working differently. And it's about giving agency to people who may not necessarily have traditionally been included in the way decisions are made. And so this afternoon, we're very lucky to have 4 panelists with us who will be able to share some of not just, I guess, their theoretical experience, but their lived experience of making co-production happen in their various fields. As Mel said, we are going to spend most of the time doing a Q&A this afternoon. If you would like to actually ask your question rather than have us read it out, please also indicate that in the chat, and Matt and Alex behind the scenes will be grabbing some of those questions. But maybe just to kick off, I'm going to ask each of the members of the panels to introduce themselves, give us a little bit of information about who you are and where you're from, and our very first question, to share your best experience or most powerful experience of co-production. Jessica, can we start with you?
Oh no. I was hoping it would be someone else. Never mind. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm Jessica Russell. I'm the co-production champion for Southend. So that's Southend-on-Sea in Essex. I've only been in the role for about 6 months, and I just need to say a little bit about its kind of conception. It's a 3-way role that was part funded by Southend Borough Council, a local charity that looks at outcomes for 0 to 4-year-olds called A Better Start Southend. That's actually, there's a couple of sites across the UK of those. They're funded by the National Lottery, and SAVS, which is the local CVS. So 3 organisations came together to say, actually, we want to make co-production more visible in Southend-on-Sea. We want to put our citizens at the heart of everything that we're doing. We want to do things together with citizens. We don't want to be doing 2. So that's the role I applied for. It was the most scary job application I've ever done in my life, but also the most rewarding. I think I was interviewed by the whole community, more or less, it felt like. And my experience of co-production is long. Before it was called co-production in many ways. It's mainly in mental health, and most recently running a recovery college in South East Essex. Is that long enough? Yes, thank you.
What about the recovery college? Do you want to give us maybe 1 or 2 sentences about how you're using co-production there?
Yes, so it was transformative. I mean, if people don't know the recovery college model, it has co-production through it like a stick of rock, which I said yesterday, so apologies to those of you that heard it yesterday. But it's kind of converting the theory into practice, and for me it was transformational because my profession is as an educator, an adult educator. So co-producing courses with people with lived experience of mental health, which is how I identify myself in any event, but in that role I was the expert by experience, by profession. So learning to put down my professional knowledge and co-produce and then deliver a richer course with better outcomes was transformational for me, and I hope was delivered the outcomes that the people that were the students coming to the courses were looking for. So for me, I'm always very interested in what happens between people, and I'm interested in how we use lived experience and professional experience to create a shared experience for other people.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. John, I might ask the same question of you. A quick introduction and your most powerful or impactful experience of co-production.
I'm a former Lucas Aerospace Combined Shop Stewards Committee member, and my story spans 44 years. So I'm going back to 1974. We were a group of shop stewards representing 9 different trade unions across 13 sites. And it was quite unique in the sense that through problems with our pension fund, we came together, amalgamation of blue and white collar workers. There was always an us and them, traditionally, the trade union movement. But pensions was one thing that brought us together. We were threatened with job loss, as most unions and people were in those days, back in the 70s. And it's a long story, but the bottom line was we went away and designed and put together an alternative plan to the companies. We audited our workforce, our members across those sites, who came up with 150 product ideas that could be made, all of which was socially useful. Many of the ideas came because of their own personal or local problems. So the product ideas ranged from hybrid cars, electric cars, wind turbines, heat pumps, dialysis machines, and so on. Many of those product ideas had never been invented back then. We worked in the aerospace industry, so we worked with aircraft turbines. So we had the idea of putting a turbine and a large propeller on a mast to create electricity. So that's why 44 years later, the product ideas we back then are now desperately needed because of climate change. The one example I can give you of the work that we did in terms of alternative products is what's happened with the recent COVID crisis that we're going through at the moment, where factories were able to convert overnight from making their normal products into making ventilators. One of the key factors I'll talk about later in the conversation is that to take some of those ideas forward, we linked into local polytechnics, linked into academia, and we linked into local authority funding in order to test out some of those product ideas. And we took them into the communities, into the cooperative movement. So it was life-changing for me because 44 years later, I'm still talking about it.
Thank you very much, John. I think a great example there of ideas coming from unexpected places, which is at the heart of co-production. Noreen, I might hand over to you. Same question.
Thank you. So I'm based in Wales and I've been involved with the co-production network for Wales pretty much from the start. It's been about 8 years now. And right now I'm working as a consultant and trainer with a range of organizations in the public and in the voluntary sector. And mainly I help people get their head around co-production and what it is and what it isn't, and when do you do it, when do you not do it, and make it a day-to-day habit and the way you do things rather than an extra thing that you have to think about on top of your normal stuff. And I guess I couldn't pinpoint one most powerful experience in the practice, but I think it's every time I see that penny drop and people move from, ooh, dunno, it's a bit new and we don't know how it's going to go, to kind of the joy of it going, oh yeah, that really works. And it doesn't have to be hard and it's so powerful. And the warmth of the relationships that build up between the citizens and the teams and all the different actors in the system, that always fills me with joy. And that's the thing that keeps me going, seeing that moment of revelation for people.
Thanks, Noreen. Susan.
Hi everyone, I'm Susan from Scottish Community Development Centre. We host the co-production network in Scotland at SCDC. The network is funded by Scottish Government and we've been running for 8 years now. We've got quite a diverse and engaged network with over 1,400 members. And our role is really to try and support shared learning and experiences around co-production, and we act as a kind of central point for people to come and get information and resources if they choose to use co-production in the course of the work that they do. So I'm hoping to kind of share some powerful stories in the course of answering questions today. Like Noreen, I find it difficult to pinpoint just one where there's been a really big bang moment, because it doesn't really happen that way. It's about seeing changes over time, I guess. So I'll try and weave that into answering some of the questions and share some aha moments from people across the Scottish network with you.
Thanks for that, Susan. You're actually going to be first cab off the rank. How have you found, you said it's not this big bang moment of making co-production more than just the buzzword, the next trendy thing. How have you gone about seeding that kind of long-term change?
I guess we have almost the luxury of having 8 years of an organised network in Scotland. And what I can say, and reflecting back to the early days, is we spent a lot of time trying to define co-production and finding a common definition for co-production. And I guess what we've learned over that time is that, and you said it in your introduction, that co-production can mean different things to different people, and it's not necessary to get tied up in the language or seeing it as a buzzword, or really kind of using it as a piece of jargon. I think what we've learned and what people have told us from the network is it's the way of working that's important. And literally co-production can happen in any context between any different groups of people, between two individuals. And that's some of the kind of stories that we've been capturing from the network, just to try and take away from that notion that the word itself isn't important. And actually what we find people, when they're taking forward co-production processes, particularly with community members or people with lived experiences, you don't mention the C word at all. It's not important.
Thank you very much for that. I might follow up with you, Noreen. You mentioned in your opening there, in your introduction, that it's really about relationships and coming together as people at the end of the day. Can you share a little bit about how you found it valuable to involve people in the decision making and the benefits that you and they have found through the process?
Sure. The old style way of doing public services tends to be that somebody in an office somewhere is tasked with deciding what the problem is, deciding what the solution is, designing the solution, allocating resources and strategies and implementation plans. And then maybe it goes out to consultation. And if at that point people say it's not what they want, it's probably going to run anyway because we've invested all that time and energy into it. And in some of the cases that we've been working on and co-producing projects and strategies and all sorts of things, so my work ranges from, taking convening a community conversation to helping the Welsh Government write a strategy for the local economy and everything in between. Actually, in a lot of cases, the decision isn't the important thing. Somebody could make a decision somewhere, and if they know what's going on the ground, if they've got their finger on the pulse enough, it's quite likely that they might make a good decision. People, community workers who are embedded in that communities probably know what's the thing that needs to happen. But the thing is, that doesn't create the ownership and doesn't create the shared vision around it. And so the relationship building and the shared ownership and the everybody participating in the debate and being part of that decision means that we might come to the same result on paper, the same decision is made, but actually the engagement with it and the fact that we feel that we're all doing this together, the dynamics of it is completely different. So the relationship building creates this, it's all of us deciding this together as opposed to somebody having the power delegated to them. And the relationship aspect really ties in closely to the power aspect. If somebody on their own has to write this thing, it's their responsibility, but also they hold the power to call the shots. Whereas if we're doing it together, we still have the option to come to a different result or a different strategy or a different option because we've decided this together.
Thanks very much, Noreen. I might just remind people, if you do have any questions for our panelists, to pop them in the chat, and we'll start asking some of those shortly. John, I might ask the same question of you, though you were working in a very different context, so not social services, but in a corporate environment or an industrial environment. What did you see, or how were you able to demonstrate the power of involving people in decision making?
It should work, and they certainly work with ourselves, is by having a true democratic process. Our members elected the shop stewards to represent them, and the shop stewards represented the executive of the committees. But we had site meetings and we had our individual meetings on a regular basis. We had to make sure that we had the support of everyone as we went along. We couldn't take control of the situation and say to our members, we know what's right for you. We had to take on board what they believed was right for them. And I totally believe in empowering people by giving them the opportunity to be part of a democratic process, and from that giving them empowerment, and from that you gain commitment. And that's what happened in our case. The members were committed to each other, and they were committed to each site across the board. We were all part of the same problem, so we had to collectively find the solutions. Now that brought, for example, people on the shop floor having a great idea, but not knowing how to convert it into a product. So we went and took the idea to a design team. The design team looked at the concept and used their skills to design a way forward. So it was a collective approach. Once the design was put together, I went back to the person whose idea it was, say, this is what you were looking at, this is what you're thinking about, could it be improved? One example for me was I was an electrician in those days. I remember machines breaking down. I used to, when I started off, go up to a machine and work my way through, try and find the fault. So I'd be there for quite a while. And I learned quite quickly from an older electrician, if you've got a problem, go to the operator and say to the operator, what's the problem? And they can usually tell you this problem's happened on a number of occasions, and this is where you should look. And I believe that is true in everything that we do. We have to ask the questions of the people affected.
Thanks very much for that, John. We might go to one of the questions from the participants. Michelle Dawson has asked, when it comes to consultation and decision making, how do you make sure you don't end up with a group of people who are, quote, representing bigger groups of people, but who often aren't representative? And how do we end up moving past getting just the usual suspects being involved in design and decision making? Susan, is this something that you'd like to address?
Yes, I mean, this has come up quite a few times for us over the course of many different approaches in community development. And, you know, quite often even just the term of usual suspects implies that that's people who don't necessarily have something to give, when actually they're often very experienced in their own communities and the issues that are at play there. So I think maybe what I'm thinking is, how do we widen it out to include others? That's not just, I suppose, the usual suspects. And I guess the answer for me is to try and create opportunities where you're having conversations with people who aren't necessarily involved in community activities or community life. And quite often that just means that we need to go to different places where people are and find a way of having that conversation that's not necessarily about immediately then bringing them into those types of processes that we have planned and that we do as professionals. So we've seen quite a lot of examples of that in the participatory budgeting programmes and processes in Scotland, where instead of expecting people to come to you and you invite them into your pre-planned events, etc., you need to go where people are at. And people are everywhere. It's just, the trick is just finding out what your best chances are of kind of harnessing the types of things that people are getting involved in as they go about their daily business in their own communities.
Thanks for that, Susan. Jessica, I might turn to you. Have you had some experiences or some examples of doing just that, novel ways of finding out maybe who's not in the room that should be and really reaching out to include them in processes?
Yes, thank you. I think, Erin, it goes back to what Noreen was saying about, it not being something that you do as an engagement piece of work. It's relationships that you nurture and sustain and embed throughout the work that you do, however you do it, whatever organisation that is. And I think from my experience, it's about, it can be fun. I think, and it also goes back to the idea that you've not already done the thinking, because I think if you've already done the thinking and then you go to where people are, you're kind of asking those preloaded questions. So, I mean, an example for me was we've got 3 tower blocks in Southend, and we kind of had just a very loose idea around a family learning opportunity, and we kind of co-produced a gardening project. This was many years ago, but we involved everybody in getting everybody involved, if you see what I mean. So not everybody in the tower blocks wanted to be involved, but we spoke to the housing association, and we spoke to the caretakers, and the caretakers said yes, we'd be happy to put a leaflet through when we're cleaning the different floors. And then the people came down and had a meeting in the communal area that was downstairs in the flats, and the children came and the parents came, and we had tea and biscuits, and we just talked about whether that was something people wanted to do, and it was, and the community centre were involved. So people are where they are, and if you invite them into you, that's lovely, but actually I always think there's a bit of a potential power play in that. And if you go to where people are, then it's more equal. But I think you have to be visible, and you have to be seen to be doing that. And those relationships aren't just going to come because you decide one day you're going to click your fingers and do some consultation. I think you have to put in the effort, and you have to mean it. And I think what Noreen said about somebody who kind of has those links into the community will often know what the solution is, but the point is that you build the relationships and bring people around those conversations as you go.
Thanks for that. We've had a question from Tracy, who asked, do we have lead voices from the community, such as community champions who speak for the wider community? And if so, how do you select these, or how do you build relationships with these people? Noreen, would you like to take that one?
That's a big question. Okay, so many things in my head about this. In a way, it's not up to us to select the people. Our job is to put the invitation out there in as accessible and inclusive a way as possible. Like Jessica said, we've got to put in the effort. But then it's up to people to respond, and in a certain measure it will be self-selecting. We will get the people who are interested in that kind of work and who want to be part of it, but that's also right because they're the people who are going to bring the energy to it and who will be interested in being on the journey with you. And it will snowball. You might start with 2 people, and that's fewer than you were hoping for, but that's okay, because over time others will see what's going on and will want to join in because they see things going on, and especially if it's fun or if change actually tangibly happens, then people will come on the journey with you. So you don't have to get it completely 100% right and everybody all of the right from the beginning, but do keep asking the question, who's not in the room? Because often, you'll get your first 2 people, and they're the ones who already, they're the early adopters. They're the ones who are already committed to this kind of cause and to working with you and to doing this thing. But actually, they will know who else isn't in the room. And as you bring in more people into the conversation, keep asking who's not here, and use your networks of networks. You're not expected to know everybody you need to know right from the off. But between all of you together, you will be able to reach everyone eventually.
Thank you for that. On the topic of I guess, designing inclusive experiences that people do feel that they are able to take up that invitation. Susan, have you had any tips or tricks that, you know, from work that you've done around how you can create that environment that people want to participate and want to join in?
Yes, I think there are many examples of that taking place, and I think it's about taking a kind of planned approach, but not, as Noreen said, not taking all the decisions at the beginning. So there's the term that we can often use with that is it's kind of not rocket science. It's really just about thinking carefully about what opportunities you're creating with people to have a conversation. And actually, I think one of the things that we also know about wider kind of participatory processes in Scotland, and I guess this would be the case in other countries as well, is that co-production is about really moving away from that one-off kind of consultation, which is still pretty prevalent in how we do things and how agencies interact with the communities that they serve. And even in good quality community engagement processes, you know, they're maybe not going far enough and into that kind of co-production territory to make sure that, you know, maybe in some instances a one-off conversation is fine and it serves your purposes and people are happy with that. But it's about how you're creating processes where you can have an ongoing debate and dialogue about the issues of the day. And actually, once you invite people in, I think there's some unattributed statistic, for example, that I've heard about, that, you know, 70% of people don't volunteer because they've never been asked. When you think about that in participatory terms and asking community members to talk about, you know, whatever issue it is that you're interested in, half the time it's just about asking. And people tend to respond fairly well from that. And once you capture their imagination, and if it is something they're genuinely interested in, they'll be motivated to do more. So I guess it's not kind of, again, one size fit all. And we tend to shy away from saying there's any prescriptive model around this way of working. It's just really about thinking through what it is you're trying to do and who it is that you need to speak to make things better.
Thank you for that. Jessica, this one is for you. It's a question that Susanna has asked in the chat, which is, what would be some great persuasive arguments to NHS decision makers who say that due to deadlines, they, quote, don't have the time to fully incorporate a co-produced approach? Something I think even beyond the NHS, we all hear when we talk about co-production with decision makers.
Oh dear, this touches a little bit of a nerve today, Erin. Do decision makers have time to waste money on poor outcomes, on poor health outcomes for the community? Do decision makers have time to have people coming to them in poorer health with a less likelihood of a good outcome? I just throw it straight back, because if you want to spend time, if you want to spend money and not time, then fine, go ahead. But I would definitely say that the investment in terms of understanding what it is that patients need and want from services will repay that investment of time, which does cost money. You know, I can't put a quantity on it, but I'm just going to say threefold. There's research that shows that the relationship between patients and doctors, if they have that co-productive mindset, that the outcomes are better for the patients. So you know, there's that outcomes and the financial side of things. But I'd also just say it's an ethical, moral question for systems. It's not an I don't have time question. Actually, I would flip it and say, does a system have time and resource to waste when lives are at risk, really? And that's at the acute end of medicine. There's a whole other public health preventative piece, which is ideally suited to co-production.
Thank you for that. John, I might turn to you. We've also had a question about the times that you know people have invested in co-production, but it hasn't necessarily worked out or led to the outcomes that people had hoped. Would you have any stories that you'd be able to share where maybe things didn't go quite as planned?
the plan was put forward we started putting the plan together in 1974 and presented it to the company in 1976. It was tragic that they decided not to take on board the ideas, the products that we had. However, whenever they threatened redundancies, we just pulled out the plan and said, well, we can make these instead. So it was a success in terms of saving jobs over a 2 or 3 year period. The failure in the fact that they didn't make the products. Now, we also blame the Labour governments of the day as well, because they were prepared to spend millions of public money in the arms industry, but not prepared to spend millions of public money on the products that would have supported the public and the people in greatest need, and that's the same of many governments. So in that context, we failed in the sense that we didn't get the products that we wanted made by ourselves. 40 years later, it's a success in the sense that although we didn't make the products, those products, the hybrid cars, the wind turbines, heat pumps, are being made by workers somewhere that are paying into their communities and into their households. So jobs are being sustained. But we're going through another crisis. The aerospace industry, the defence industry are now at massive risk of thousands of jobs, and they should be planning for what is it they could make to sustain their communities as well. Because if you look at the site that I worked in, which is a bomb site now, it's just derelict land. Not only did we lose our factories and our jobs, but we lost all the local shops, the local industries, the people in the supply chain. All those jobs went, so there's houses, communities were lost as well as our jobs. So we were successful in many respects. Failure was we didn't persuade them to put the products that we had into production back in those days.
Thank you for that, John. Noreen, you have asked the follow-up question about what DISC is. Mark had asked a question of, can those who have established co-production practices clarify if the projects have been inclusive of all personality types, such as the DISC model, or whether this process tends to be self-selective according to personality type?
Does that mean you're throwing that one at me, Erin?
I am throwing that one at you.
Fair enough. I think it comes back to the accessibility and the inclusion and the keep inviting people in all the different ways possible thing that we've been talking about. It's really important to open as many channels of conversation and communication as possible to do this work. There's some related questions in the chat in terms of, digital exclusion and using online spaces, and we have to at the moment, or we have had to, but it can't be the only one, because it's an advantage in some respects, but it's a disadvantage for other people. And actually we've got to, if we're serious about having conversations that involve the greatest number, then we have to open all the different channels that we have available to us. And that includes face-to-face and digital and phone and email and writing letters and however people prefer to be involved. And that means that depending on your personality type, then you might have a preference for one or the other, or depending also on your circumstances and, childcare or travel or anything else, all the other factors in our lives. That means there should be a way for everybody, ideally. And we might not get it right straight away. We might not either have them all available or think of them right away, because we know our own experience, and the more practice we get, the more opening we have about that. But we're not perfect either. But being open to suggestions and people saying, oh, I want to do, can I write in, or can I have a phone call, or can I do something different from what's offered? I think giving the invitation that if it doesn't suit you, tell us what will suit you, and we'll try and figure out how we can connect over this and have this conversation. I think let's leave the other options so people can say what would work for them if none of the options provided do work for them. So it's about giving people as much choice as possible. One of the most powerful things I've seen in events, particularly when we're having conversations and spending time reflecting and debating, is to give people some quiet time to think before we go into conversation and questions. And that's really good for introverts like me, who need a bit of pondering time before we want to speak, and we want to do the thinking before we speak. And extroverts tend to kind of figure it out as they say it. And we need to cater for all these different also learning styles, and having visuals, having text, not having text, having the audio, as many ways of communicating as possible, which increases the complexity and the work, but also increases the return and the value of what you get, because you make sure everybody's in it.
Thank you very much for that. Susan, we've had an excellent question from Ellie Sandercock in the chat, which is around, I guess, not just inclusion, but meaningful inclusion. And we've seen over the last several weeks through the Black Lives Matter movement, really our attention being focused on how are we making sure that we don't just have a tokenistic involvement of communities like Black, Indigenous, people of colour. So in your experience, have you got any cases or experiences that you're able to share on meaningful inclusion of people who maybe have felt excluded by the system to date?
Yeah, so one of the examples of a piece of work that I'm currently involved in is a programme called All In for Change. It's a programme of work to try and make sure that people's lived experience of homelessness is reflected in and influences all the initiatives to end homelessness in Scotland and all the campaigns. So we work with 2 other homeless charities in Scotland with a change team, which is a collection of 30 people with either lived experience of homelessness or who provide frontline services. And quite often you'll find that people wear both those hats involved in the change team. So we meet on a monthly basis at monthly retreats, and the last 3 of which have been online. That certainly brought its own challenges to make sure that people were still able to participate for a variety of different reasons. And like Noreen said, we had to pay particular attention to making sure that people had the kit to participate online, that they had the data on their phones, if that they were using their phones to use the platforms we were using. And quite a challenge to move that from a face-to-face relationship building type of method where we would go away to spend the day together in a building somewhere. But what I guess I think has made that quite successful in co-production terms is that it's an iterative process. We've found as the 3 lead agencies, at least at the beginning, that we're now stepping back gradually as people start to grow their confidence and find their voice to share their experiences and what is critical and important to them in terms of trying to end homelessness. And there's been a lot of research that they're considering around that. But for me, what's good about that, it makes a difference if you do have some resources. This particular programme is funded by Scottish Government because they're genuinely interested to see people with lived experience coming to the fore, because they will have incentives, the motivation, the passion and energy to actually make a difference. And actually it's such a complex issue and it can't be solved without their participation. So having a regular kind of ongoing checking in and out where we have those kinds of conversations where we now sit back and watch people kind of discuss with each other what they're seeing in the midst of this pandemic, how it relates to what their previous experience is, and what actions they want to take and what opportunities they see to try and address some of these issues. So I guess, again, kind of similar to what Noreen's saying, the monthly retreats are one thing, but we're in constant contact with people in between. And some people like to talk in a one-to-one phone call, others are happy participating in breakout rooms on Zoom. They're happier in the bigger group as well. So I guess it's a variety of methods that is making that a good experience for them. And it's certainly my favourite bit of work that I'm involved in at the moment.
Thank you. Jessica, I might throw to you for this one. I think maybe to go back to that idea that it's not a one-off, it's not a transactional engagement, thinking about what strategies you've used, and maybe if you have some particular stories that you could share to really start to build that trust when you're working with communities who maybe are coming from a place where they have very good reasons not to trust the co-production process.
Well, that's a great question, says she, buying a little bit of time to think. So I think it's to do with, sorry, can you remind me the question? It's gone. Erin.
We have many of the communities who are most affected by some of these wicked challenges that we are using co-production as a way to grapple with, don't have trust in the institutions that many of us represent. So how can we start to grow that trust with them to start on the path to co-production?
I'm back in the room on that one. Okay, so I think you need what I'm going to call a cultural broker for now. Don't assume that you're the person to do that piece of work to start with. You need to come alongside a trusted person who's within that community. So and just before, in case I forget what I'm going to say, I'll give an example in a minute, is that once you've started to have some conversations with the community, you have to show up, you have to be consistent, you have to do what you say you're going to do. You cannot let people down. I cannot say how kind of strong that is, that you can't just forget. I mean, I forget lots of things all the time. People who know me will know that. You know, I've got lots of organisational challenges, but I always try to communicate. So I'll give an example. Last year we did the Windrush. We co-produced the Windrush celebrations locally. And although I live in a mixed heritage family, from you know, my mother-in-law is Windrush generation, I didn't assume that I had an automatic link into the local Windrush community, because I didn't. So I put my kind of, let's call them tentacles, out and engaged with somebody who I knew of, who I thought was in the community, and said, do you want to, are you interested in working on this? Do you think this is worth doing? How do you feel about Windrush? I'm not sure how I feel about it. Tell me what you think. What do the people you know think? And from that, we organised 3 events, and we brought a lot of people together to tell us how it was for them, but they were kind of coming out and being more visible and using the community assets that we have, and hopefully that was something that was useful for them. I thought it was wonderful, and it was an incredibly powerful piece of work. And that's when you know when you're doing co-production, when you suddenly have that kind of unfolding sense of, you know, this is a very powerful, transformative thing, and it can be a little bit scary, and you have to be out of your comfort zone. But as much as I'm out of my comfort zone, so is the community that I'm seeking to co-produce with. So if I'm not uncomfortable, then there's probably something wrong, because I'm asking people to come out of their comfort zone too. But I mean, it's not about me, and it's what Susan was saying. You know, actually, once those relationships are established, then you probably don't need to be there anymore. So.
Thank you for that. Might just shift gears a little bit at this point. I think we've got a room of, I assume, co-production converts with us, but you know, when all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look a bit like a nail. John, I'm interested from you, when do you think are the right times to do co-production, and when are maybe some of the times that co-production is not the best method to bring to the table?
Sorry, was that for me? Sorry, Erin, was that for me?
That was for you, John.
Oh,
Shall I repeat it?
Can I do a Jessica and ask you to repeat the question?
You certainly can. We know that co-production isn't the answer to every situation. What are some of your maybe principles or guidelines or advice for people today about when co-production is the right path to go down and when maybe it's not?
That is a difficult question. From our point of view, going back to when we started. It was the right time because our jobs were at risk, and so it was preordained that we needed to do something or stand back and allow ourselves to be put out of work. So in that context, that's what I would say. But that was the right time. The wrong time is just for the hell of it. There has to be a reason, there has to be a need to have a strategy, and there needs to be a plan to deal with it. You can't just politically decide that it's time to have a, go into battle with it, with a government or a local authority. For the last 18 years of my life, I worked in the fire service. I'm still active in Unison. So my trade union roots have been with me all my working life. Now, one thing that we had in Birmingham recently was a dispute with home care workers. A local authority, a Labour council, decided to attack their contracts. And they're the lowest paid, they're mainly women. But the way that everyone organised around them and supported them across the board was incredible. This was before the COVID breakout. And again, that was the right time to do something collectively about it. But I don't think it's right to just organise to attack or debate for the hell of it. There has to be a reason, there has to be that sense of purpose by which co-cooperation exists. It has to be a catalyst that brings people together. And the best people to determine that are those that have been affected the most in any situation. I guess that's the way I could respond to that, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much, John. Maureen, I might get you to follow up on that one, which is, what do you think are some of the maybe not necessary conditions, but things that you might want to see that you have in place before you start thinking about co-production? What are some of the factors that are more likely to make co-production successful?
All these questions are really big, aren't they? This co-production stuff, it encompasses so many things. Okay, so a bunch of factors from my brain in no particular order. There's got to be a reason to talk about it. And I love what John just said about don't do it just for the hell of it. That's just big light bulb moment for me, because when I think about when not to do co-production, I think a lot about I love complexity theory, and I like, when you have when you're building a rocket, you need to know, you need the people who know, you need the specialists, you need to bring the experts in. But when it's about people's lives and when it's about relationships, you need to gather the people and bring all the people concerned around the table to be part of the conversation. I usually attack it like that, but actually the question before that is, what's the point? What are we trying to do? In Wales, we've got a set of legislation that encourages, I'm going to say, as a moderate term, the adoption of co-production and citizen involvement in various sectors. There's always gaps in the implementation of visionary pieces of legislation, but at least it's given people an awareness of these things, a reason to ask the question, what should we know actually about working with people about co-production? What is this thing we're supposed to do? And executive teams and chief executives and senior leadership teams tend to either accept that it's a good idea for financial or moral, ethical kind of system reasons because it gives us good outcomes. And then we talk to people on the front line, and it makes complete sense because it's about being able to show up as people, supporting the people we're supporting in the right way at the right time when the need is there, without being constrained by historical not helpful systems. But then we've got a whole bunch of people in the middle, the managers, the team leaders, the people who manage the systems that enable this work to happen. And they're being asked to change completely what they're doing without knowing what the new thing looks like, because we have to create together as we go along. So we can't give them an answer. And they have to keep delivering the day-to-day because people's lives are at stake. And that's really, really difficult for them. And my heart goes out to everybody who's in that situation, being pretty much asked to do the impossible, but we have to do it because it's not all right to keep doing the old pattern either. So one of the things that we need there is very clear buy-in, very clear commitment from executive teams, but also so much support, so much trust and relationship building, all the stuff we've talked about doing with our communities, with our citizens, with the people we're trying to co-produce with. It has to happen within organizations. We can't expect somebody to have warm, life-enhancing human interactions with the people they support if they're part of a system that's all about key performance indicators and about slaps on the wrist if they don't do the thing by the book. So we've got to have this culture change. And for me, that's the biggest enabler. And it's the most frustrating thing to say because I can't say, okay, everyone, go do culture change and it'll be great. But actually we have to chip away at it bit by bit. And so the things that will enable it, that will get us over these hurdles, is everybody doing their little bit. Just because you write policy or just because you're working on the front line doesn't mean you don't have a role to play in this bigger picture. So everyone has to have I guess, a commitment to this approach. And like Susan said right at the beginning, I don't care if you never call it co-production, it doesn't matter, but it's that value space, the way of saying, you know, how do we think about power? How do we show up? Sorry, I'm going on a bit, but I've just had another thought about this, which is we need to think seriously about who we are as civil servants and public servants and professionals. But also on the other side of the equation, we need to think about who we are as service users and citizens, and you know, how do we define ourselves and how do we take responsibility and how do we share responsibility? It's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to say, I haven't got the answers. We'll figure it out together. But that requires quite a bit of soul searching and defining who we are again, slightly differently from how we might have up to now. And we don't talk enough, I think, about the personal work that happens, the internal work that happens so that we can do the external change. I'll shut up for now.
Thank you very much. For something that was just coming to you in no particular order, it was a fantastic answer, Noreen. Susan, maybe if I can turn to you now. Noreen said, you know, quite rightly, this is about culture change and long-term institutional thinking differently. What might be some of the ways that we can know that those changes are starting to happen? What are the kind of glimmers of hope or success metrics that we could look at as practitioners to see that we're on the right track?
Yeah, that's a big question too. I think one of the good things about the network is because we have that kind of common point or focal point for people to share their stories. And as I said, I think earlier, co-production can literally happen in any context between lots of different people. But the fact that we have the network means we're able to amass a kind of a body of practice and really good stories about where this is taking place and what context it's taking place. And because it's a kind of membership-led organisation, you know, we can all then coalesce around and be champions for co-production. I mean, I guess in terms of whether it's affecting culture change, I find that we quite often talk about culture change, but I'm not sure I've ever experienced any. And I've been involved in this for a long time. So, I mean, I think culture change is something that you need to look at almost generationally. So it's difficult to then, when you're in the midst of trying to adopt these kind of practices in your working life where the actual change is, I guess it has to be reflected on over a longer period. And I guess, you know, the other side of that is we need to plan for seeing culture change for a longer period than we often have the luxury of doing. I mean, we will mobilise ourselves in whatever work that we're doing around short-term funding cycles that, to be honest, we say we're achieving change through outcomes. In actual fact, the issues we're dealing with are so complex, we're probably not hitting the mark with that. It will take longer, but we are confined by the frameworks and the constraints organisationally that doesn't necessarily allow that to happen. So I'm going to come back to Noreen's point just to finish that thought and say we should all do what we can. We should carve out the opportunities we see to take this kind of approach forward in the nature of what we do. And actually, I've heard some talk about whether there should be a network in England. I would thoroughly recommend it for those reasons. It does allow people to come around in a kind of a collective way to try and make sure there are more opportunities moving forward. And that will all make a big difference when we count it all up and aggregate it over. So we may not be there yet, but I feel that we're on our way to something positive.
Thank you for that, Susan. I think now we're going to turn to the unspoken elephant in the room, which is COVID-19 and how we see co-production as having had a role not only in the way that voluntary organisations and local authorities have responded, but in how the sector can actually continue and recover. Jimmy Hunter in the chat asked a question. As we emerge from COVID lockdown, we're seeing parts of the third sector struggling and sometimes going under. Where in the process does the panel see co-production being key in making this recovery successful? I might hand that one to Jessica, if that's okay.
Erin, it's like, you know, when I'm reading some of the great comments and I think, oh, that's a great comment, a great comment. So the question's about COVID, right, and how we're going to use co-production. Okay. Well, I think it's happening, you know, so I don't want to give a politician's answer, but it is happening. People co-produce throughout, you know, neighbours knocked on each other's doors, organisations who don't normally necessarily work together, volunteers, people really did come together. And also I was just thinking about culture change and how students locally organised some Black Lives Matter protests in Southend, but they did it pretty organically and they used their social channels and, you know, they were all socially distanced, but that was co-production as well. And so it is everywhere. I think sometimes when that question comes up, it's maybe the question is more about how can statutory services or health services, you know, harness that. But I think mainly you kind of need to stop asking yourselves, and I'm not saying you're asking that question, Erin, I know why you're asking it, but come out of those kind of organisational silos, stop talking to each other about it, and go and see what's happening and how you can link with that, because you don't have to lead all of that work. So of course you do with things like test, track, and trace, whatever it is, you know, but actually those messages are going to hit land where they need to better, more resonantly. If you do, even if you co-produce that, you know, if you go and ask, work with local people who want to, and say, you know, what's going to change your behaviour, because I think Leicester has shown us that, you know, it is a local issue, and that locally we do need to kind of have local messages that hit home. So for example, Southend, you know, gets lots and lots of seaside visitors. What messaging do we need in our community to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves within our communities? How do we want to manage that? And I don't think that the kind of somebody not making up, but some very expert person over there can necessarily message around all of that for all of the communities. And I think it's a great opportunity to do co-production with a diverse range of residents, really. That's a bit of an answer, it's not the whole answer. Big question.
I like to think of them as lots of space for a wide variety of experiences and answers that we've got here this afternoon. Building on that point, I'm interested, John, from you, how you see, you mentioned that your experience with co-production was around economic recovery and in a period of unions working to save jobs. As we think about the role of co-production in helping the economy build back better and helping businesses respond, what would your advice be, or how could you see co-production playing a role?
Well, in 2014, we had a 40th anniversary celebration conference to celebrate 40 years from when the plan was launched. And a group called the Lucas Plan 40 was created, with a number of people from a range of sectors coming together, forming subcommittees to provide expertise and support across the board to any group or any organisation, any community that would like to tap into their expertise. They can go out and help them formulate their own local plans. coming back to what was just spoke about, I think co-production has taken on a completely new dimension because of COVID, where we've seen dozens and dozens of micro activities take place in the community of support. No particular leadership, it's just materialised, it's just grown. And I think as we come out of this, we'll see even more opportunities for conversion of different sorts. One thing that's going to be crucial isn't production conversion, it's economic conversion that's going to be required. There has to be a political will and there has to be an economic will to service whatever the model will be afterwards. But I can see that communities will have to be redesigned to meet the new demands that are going to be taking place and the new pressures that will be put onto local communities as we move forward. And it's going to take a whole range of people to work collectively to work that way forward. There'll be new models of co-production, I'm sure, as things progress. And there'll be different demands called upon us. But you're quite right, the speakers, Susan and Jessica and Noreen have alluded to, is that we have to make sure that we're there to support, but we don't always have to lead. But what we can do is use that expertise to help pull people together. I love the analogy that Noreen used about the rocket. The question is, where do we target it? Where's the destination? We can build it, we can pull the expertise in and design it, but we need to know, where are we aiming for? Where is that target? And those questions need to be asked at the beginning. It has to be asked of the people who need that change. What is it you actually want? I hate to argue things, but one of the things that we did in Lucas, linking into polytechnics and using students, I was involved in third world development back in the days of the civil war in Eritrea, and I spent time with Oxfam looking at some of the ideas that we had. I remember a story being told of a group of people going into an African village and seeing that the women were having to walk 7 or 8 miles to get water from the river and to wash their clothing. And so this group of people decided to drill a well in the centre of the village. And they did, and they got fresh water immediately, but almost destroyed the infrastructure of that village life. Because while the women were going to the river 7 miles away and having their chats and their social distancing in a communal way, and the men were back in the village doing their own thing, and I'd been doing it for hundreds of years, all of a sudden, everything and the dynamics of everything changed. They didn't actually ask the villagers, where would you like the well to be drilled? And I think that is going to be the catalyst for the way forward when we look at designing our futures. So I'm sorry for hugging the mic too long. It's just something I feel quite passionate about.
Not at all. And I have a follow-up question. Meg in the chat asked about, I think we're experiencing a time people in the chat have been saying whole families have dropped off the radar. People are so busy trying to look after their kids, work from home, or if they're unemployed, working out how they're going to manage their lives through this period, that it's quite tempting to take service patterns or things we've seen work elsewhere and just rush to implement them. Jessica, I'm interested in that tension between deploying things that we know have worked in other circumstances and doing co-production at a time where maybe the people we want to co-produce with don't have the mental or emotional or physical bandwidth to join in.
Question. Sorry, I was answering something on the chat box. There's so much good stuff in the chat, and I'm between two things. I think it goes back to what matters to people at that point. Services clearly sometimes are needed, and maybe people don't necessarily want to be involved at that time. I think that's okay. I think what concern, you know, one of the challenges I think is if we just get too far ahead of ourselves. So I think it was Noreen that said earlier, you know, if somebody said yesterday in a conversation to do with co-production in Southend, you know, you fall in love with the problem, but equally you can fall in love with the solution. And if you kind of run off with that down the road, you cut out the opportunities for people to become involved, because there will be people who are involved, and that kind of level of not having the bandwidth does change, and it can change, you know, it can turn on a sixpence. So I'm quite a fan of a bit of a timeline, you know, a bit of a map. I mean, it can all change, but really clearly plotting out where you go back and, well, you're constantly doing it anyway, but really being quite clear about, okay, who's in the room? Do we need to go back and see if people are ready to do this? Because I think if you work in the way that's open, people will come in for the ride. I think Susan didn't use that analogy, but if you're there and you're visible and you're actively open to people coming in, then I find it very hard to envisage a situation where no one would eventually join in, unless you're completely barking up the wrong tree. I feel like I'm waffling. There was something else I want to say, but I'm afraid it's gone.
Thanks for that, Jessica. There is so much good material in the chat that we'll definitely be keeping, and you'll be able to all interact with that after the session. I'm going to ask every one of our panelists a final question now, which is, if someone is thinking of doing co-production, what would be your number one tip or advice on how to start or where to look for help? And I'm going to go to John first. How would you get started?
Is to have a plan, and that needs to incorporate everyone. The last thing you want to do is to build up expectations that can't be met, so it has to be managed. We have to manage people's expectations, so we have to find a way that allows us to collectively identify and design what is appropriate for the needs of that particular group that we can manage. And so the last thing we want to do is to build up expectations, not deliver, and then lose people completely. So we need to incorporate all those from the bottom up in order to put a plan together effectively, and then call upon the expertise around us to help see it happen.
Thank you for that, John. Susan, I might go to you next. What would be your where to start top tip for the people in the room today?
You would imagine I would say this, but I think the CoPro Network website is a good starting point for people in Scotland, and I'm picking up some requests, I suppose, through the group chat. And so can I just say, for anyone who's interested in having a conversation about finding out a bit more about co-production or different examples or different tools and frameworks, then we can please do get in touch directly with me, and we'll also post some information on the Mighty Network following today's event. So if you do have any questions or are looking for stuff, we can absolutely help with that. And can I just maybe finish that by saying, I suppose one of the biggest aha moments for me, and something I consistently use in terms of co-production, and it helps me in whatever context that I'm in, is that it's both uncomfortable but also liberating to know that you don't have to have the answer. You know, I think often the destination point, when you're truly using a co-production process, you don't know what that destination point is. And one of the really great things that we've started to see emerge in Scotland is some of the big funders are actually funding this type of approach. You can actually say in your applications, you know, we don't know what outcomes we're going to achieve here. We literally want you to fund us to explore this particular thorny issue and involve the right people and get a discussion going about this and try to solve some of the entrenched problems that we have. And I think that's great. We had a learning event just prior to lockdown, and it was taking a chance in co-production, and it was actually looking for stories from funders who have said, we are willing to invest our money in this. and we think you're the right people to do it. So I think there are loads of opportunities around, but bear in mind, in any given situation, and it's almost, you almost feel compelled to provide an answer. You don't have to. I think Jessica did it very well in an earlier question that was posed, to just turn that back on its head and say, well, what do you think? And I think that's quite a useful little tip and prompt that I've used in the course of discussions I've had with people.
Thank you, Susan. Jessica, I might throw to you, same question. What would be your top tip or where to start for people interested in starting their co-production journey?
Well, I think I'd say don't assume it's co-production, because it may only be you that gives a damn about it. But assuming that there are some other people, find them and don't think too much about it until you've found them, because if you get too attached to your idea or your solution or what you see as the problem, you suck out the air a little bit for other people to join in. I like to think of things having their own energy, and more people create more energy. But if you've kind of dictated it, and you know, you take up all, and I'm very prone to this, you know, my brilliant ideas, they're not brilliant, they're just my ideas. So I've had to learn to go, actually your ideas aren't that great, and they'll be better with other people around them. So in terms of what Susan was saying, we did exactly that with Windrush. I wrote to the funders because they gave us no time, and I said, we want to co-produce with the community, with the Windrush community, but we don't have the contacts yet. So I'm suggesting this, but what we did was completely different because the community co-produced it. But what I had to be prepared to accept that was that the community might have said, we're not interested in doing this. We don't want to do that. So I think that's my top tip, is don't assume that just because you think it's something that's important that anyone else does, and go and find the people that do, and do the co-create with them, co-create your thinking, your ideas, the whole 9 yards.
Thank you, Jessica. And last but not least, Noreen.
Thank you. I think I'll give 2 practical actions to begin with. If you're starting a co-production project, with the caveat that there isn't really any co-production projects, you're building a co-production relationship. So it builds on what came before, and stuff will happen after. But if you've got something specific, a specific piece of work that you're looking at, start by mapping the people whose lives are touched by what you're trying to do. All literally the stakeholders, you know, who's got a stake in this? And it could be partner organizations, it could be your own teams and colleagues, it'll be lots of different kinds of people in the community. So map that out and treat that as a living document, because there'll be gaps in that. And the more you talk to people, the more you'll find gaps, but also the more you'll discover more groups to add to the picture. And on the back of that, go and talk to different people in those different audiences. And the best question you can ever ask, if you don't know what else to ask, just tell me about what is it like to live with dementia? What is it like to be a young person coming out of care? What is it like to be living in lockdown in your context? And listen. The biggest thing you can do is just listen. You'll learn so much just from doing that. So put your assumptions and put your questions to one side. It's not to say they're not valid, and actually past knowledge, past research, all the stuff that happened before, we're not throwing it out, but actually try and start by listening first to get a picture of what's going on in front of you that you might not be privy to. Building on what Jessica said, find your tribe. That's really important, because if you're trying to do that work on your own, it can feel really lonely if you think you're the only one in your organization who believes in this way of working. And the likelihood is you're not, but you haven't found the others yet. So keep talking about this stuff and keep dropping hints. It's like dropping pebbles in a pond. See who responds and who goes, oh yeah, I think that too. Because that strength in numbers is really important. It's hard work. It's challenging work. We have to work on ourselves. We have to change people's minds. We have to change culture. Who the hell knows how to change culture? We have to change systems which are bigger than us. You know, this is difficult, challenging work. It's completely worthwhile, and I believe in it in my bones. But we've got to be together doing this. So find your networks, find the other people who believe this in your organization, outside of your organization. I'd be remiss if I didn't say about the Wales Co-Production Network as well, because I didn't really mention the whole community of practice. But but we're literally that, a community of practice. We're not funded, we're an independent organization, and we're just people who believe in co-production and in that way of working, who spend time chatting to each other, exchanging practice and experience, and sometimes just propping each other up when things are hard. And that's the biggest thing you can do. In terms of the people you're looking to co-produce with, just listen. In terms of yourself and your own self-care in this work which is hard, find your tribe.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Noreen. And thank you to all of our panelists today for their time. Building on what Noreen has said around, we don't want this to be an event. We want it to be a conversation that builds from what's gone before and the networks that you all have and the work that you've been doing, but goes somewhere else. And my colleagues will share a link in the chat to a Mighty Network community site where we hope to be able to continue this conversation with you, get to some of the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer today, and to actually share those stories and experiences that we've had as practitioners, or people who've been involved, or people who are interested in finding out more about co-production. So hopefully at least part of your tribe could be the Public Square group that we're hoping to assemble. On that note, thank you very much for everyone's time and attention this afternoon. I'm going to hand back to Mel to close the session.
Thank you, Erin. I'm the top and the tailor. I mean, what a privilege. And actually, anything that I thought I was going to say, I really don't know what to say apart from wow, because your answers, your thoughts, what you've shared has been, it's just really infused me. And to see so many people on this call has, again, really energized me. And in terms of the project that we're working for and the organisation that we're lucky enough to work for, it just shows that just create a space and, sends the opportunities out and things can happen. And reading the chat, the questions, the amazing links to resources. I mean, that's gold, isn't it, in just capturing that stuff. So, sometimes I get a bit overwhelmed with the scale of the challenges that we face as a society and as a planet. And that, those people, that person, that country, that institution or particular type of expertise is not going to be able to solve it, because we do need that diversity of knowledge and thoughts. We do need to share our ideas. We need new ideas. We need to really listen to each other. We need to challenge each other and shake it up, and really bring that multiplicity of views and lived experiences together. This is just a seed, and who knows from what can grow from these seeds. And the more that all of us can take this away, share, cogitate, champion, push if we need to, then a greater chance of solving some of these great challenges. So I just really want to end by saying a massive, massive thank you. I know we've been using kind of hand signals, but I'm going to do an actual, give everyone a round of applause to our panel.